This is the Andis Master Model M. It came out before the Andis improved, and they may have had some production that was in parallel between the two. It's got a couple of features that are a little bit different than on the improved. One is it's a 2-speed, has 3 positions on the switch. Little pointer there will point to the low, the off, and the high. And realistically, these aren't speeds. This is more like a high force, low force. In any case, it's always going to be going back and forth, oscillating at 60 Hertz or 60 cycles each second because of the power line frequency. The armature on this, or the wraps around here, and the armature is the pivot component. It actually moves based on flexing the spring steel of the armature itself underneath here, underneath the switch. So this is an Andis Master Model M. So they actually build their own switch. It's not an off-the-shelf switch. They got that. This armature goes to a fork. The fork's made out of nice spring steel. Engages a yoke which is screwed to the upper blade. The upper blade has 28 tines. The lower blade has 25 notches. The upper blade is centered on the body of the clippers, where the lower blade is actually offset a bit. And once everything is all aligned, it actually has a really nice cutting stroke across all of those. This armature, the force of the fork on the upper blade is adjustable through a set screw here. You can loosen this nut. There's a lock washer underneath it, and you can put additional pressure on the upper blade. You can also lift up on the armature, and it'll relieve the pressure on the upper blade. All you need is just sufficient force on that upper blade against the lower blade to get a nice shearing action. You don't want too much, otherwise you'll have more friction and not as much stroke and maybe some more wear. There's a couple of interesting screws here. These are securing the operator adjustment screw, and this is the stabilization screw. There's a stabilization screw and a stabilization spring. There's no performance to be gained by messing with that. It is very simply countering the user adjustment screw. So anytime you back the user adjustment screw, that block, which is fairly rigidly mounted inside of the housing, and it secures the entire armature, that block is able to pivot along a pivot screw. And so this user adjusting screw is the way that you get more or less gap here at the armature. You want as little gap there as possible. That'll keep the field constrained, it'll keep the impedance up, and it'll keep the motor running as cool as it can run. There's a lock screw here. If you try to back this out, make sure that you have this loosened, otherwise it could do some damage. Has some protection in there for the threads, you'll see in the assembly instructions. One of the nice things about the classic Andis Model M, not normally seen in a Master, is the power cord is very easily replaced. About the only other significant differences, there's an escutcheon here. This is purely by friction, no detents, and you can put this anywhere, so however you like to set your cutting. You can mess with this. It's a little stainless steel plate. We have this little hanger which folds out of the way if you'd like. That's it. We'll get to assembling this to get it to this point. This is the Andis Master housing. This is the pin. It's just pressed in to the housing, and that's a support for the motor. Got a shaft which moves this part back and forth. Not going to take that out. At the end of the shaft there are, see it? serrations right in there. It grabs onto the arm. And this is a piece of wool thread that gets pressed all the way in here. So that thread's got to go in there. We're going to install the connector now. This is one of the more challenging parts to get installed. This connector goes in from the interior, only goes one way, so if you put it in upside down it won't seat right. So you want to make sure it can seat all the way to the back of the casting. There's two clips. There's a wide side and a narrow side. The wide side you want toward this feature in the casting. You want, this is also somewhat convex, and you want it to curve toward the inside of the casting as well. And so it'll be sitting in there. Kind of need to use gravity a little bit and go ahead and let the connector raise out of the way a little bit. Just push it right up against the inside of that casting, and you'll see that connector is raised very slightly. Now, this is the trickier part. Grab that connector and you push it back. This will push against the spring on the other side. I have to push it, it's a little bit of pressure. I have another clip the same way, wide toward the casting. Casting gets the wide section and it's curving into the interior of the casting. And you give this thing a little bit of a left-hand twist so that it's up on the shelf of the connector and back on this casting as well. So a screwdriver kind of hold it in up against the casting. And you're going to give this thing a little bit of a counterclockwise twist and try to push it in there. And keep that against that connector. Once you get it most of the way in, it should be a fairly simple matter of just pushing a little bit of pressure. Those clips until they get homed all the way down to the bottom. You'll probably get this one here. There. That's it. And this one's home. So now this clip is here. That clip's there. The connector's firm. This is the field coil. This is the Model M, so it's 2 speeds rather than a single speed like the improved Master. There's a red wire and a green and a black wire. The green and the black wire go to the top. The red wire are toward the bottom. That field will just drop right in there, secured by 2 screws. Screws have a split lock on them. And that. And make sure nothing is pinched. You don't want to damage those wires. Now we're going to assemble the arm. The top of the arm, you can see where there's a notch here, and that's how you adjust the top or the height. You want that notch up. What you're going to do is you're going to put the fork on it. Where the notch is up, the fork is coming in from the bottom. There's your fork. This fork is adjustable left and right, so we're not going to make the screws very tight. We're going to leave them just snug. Here's a plate. This goes on top of that. That distributes the force to the head of the screws. And then we have 2 screws. And just chase them down. And so you're still going to be able to move it to the left and right. Next part is this is the screw that adjusts the force onto the clipper blade from this fork. And so we're going to put that screw together. There's a couple of parts to this. One is a lock nut. So the lock nut goes onto the screw, on the adjuster screw first. And you can run that pretty far down. That's good. Leave it about there. Then a star lock washer. That's an external star lock. Put that on. And then that goes right here into this casting. And this is the pivot casting. This casting goes right there. So now you can adjust the angle using this screw, and the pivot motor pivots on this pivot point. But this arm has its own pivot point, and that's right here. So that's secured with another screw. There's a split lock, and that goes there. Okay, now it's time to put the slide on. This part moves back and forth. You need to tuck it this way, up towards this side, and it's going to nestle right in there, just like that. Then you're going to have the slide. This only goes one way, so if you try to put it this way, this is going to be shotted, so that's not right. We need to have it this way. We have some flathead screws. So we have 4 flathead screws that go in here. Try the screw better. Okay, so they're all, make sure this is nice and flush right there, just like that. Next thing you want to do, you have the lever and the lever screw. This is the shoulder screw. This goes right in there. I have this piece here. Let's figure out which way this goes. So when you center it onto there, this is roughly on top of this. Right there. Now with that, okay, we're going to attach the brackets to the top. We're going to seat the field coil using the arm. One thing you want to do is make sure that this fork is tight. You also want to make sure that this moves with a little bit more difficulty than that. Okay. And loosen the field coil. A little bit. Just this red wire. I push that down onto the connector. Keep this red wire down and out of the way. There. Put this field, put the arm in. I grab this, put the screw in real quick. I'm going to do put this all the way in. Then we're going to tighten this screw and this screw to make sure that these are at zero gap. Right there. Okay, that's there. I get an 070 drill bit or a feeler gauge. I like the drill bit. I'll put that in there. Let's zero that out there. And then see, get it nice and centered on there. There we go. Now the tricky part is to get this out. So now it's time to install the do not touch screw. So there's a screw in there, and this is that's a pivot screw there. You can tighten that down a little bit. Nice and tight. There's a spring. I drop the spring down in that hole. Just like that. There's the do not touch screw. We'll go right down in there. A large screwdriver. So go all the way down until it stops. That spring is completely compressed. This is all zeroed out right there. I'm going to go ahead and back that out. So there's one turn. You should be able to push this over. All the way over. And then release it. That's all that does. So there's just one turn out. Now the do not touch screw is secured by a slug of copper. Goes right down in that hole. And a screw. That screw right there holds a slug of copper up against this set screw. So now we're going to install the user adjustment screw. There's a set screw which goes on top of a short spring, which goes on top of a copper plug, on top of the user adjustment screw, on top of another copper plug, and finally the long spring. So this is the long spring, goes in here. Copper plug. So you can see the copper plug in the hole. See the copper plug right there. First thing to do is we take this switch plate here, and it has a fork on it. That fork will go right onto that contact there. To rock it into place if it's tight. Okay, snaps. So that gets 2 machine screws. Right underneath there is an insulator. I'm going to put the insulator down in here. Try that again. Put the insulator on. The insulator just goes right underneath that plate. There we go. That plate is held on with a couple of machine screws. I'll just put that right there. Or drop those screws in place. There's one of them. Next thing we do is we're going to put this slide switch on. Slide switch has this little spring plate. And it goes around to there. And we have a retaining clip. That's it. The retaining clip can't come out because of the cover on top. So, that's it. Now we need this. It's for low speed. The low speed contact goes through the insulator, and so there's a oops. Okay. Do that again. This is the insulator. The low speed contact. Goes the black wire. High-speed contact. Okay, we have the cover.